There is a version of yourself that almost no one has seen, not the private self you share with close friends. That one has been curated too, shaped by the relationships it lives inside, edited toward the person those relationships need you to be. Not the self that appears in moments of stress or grief, which you've learned to narrate afterward in terms that preserve the image. The version I mean is more specific and more ordinary than any of those. It is the person you are in the 20 minutes between when the last person leaves and when you have to be somewhere again. The person at the screen with no consequence attached to what you do next. The person in the argument that no one will ever hear the full account of. The person making a small decision about attention, about fairness, about what to pretend you didn't notice, in a room where pretending costs nothing because there is no witness to what you actually chose. You have told yourself that this version is not quite the real you, that the circumstances are unrepresentative, that everyone has moments, that what matters is the pattern, and the pattern, judged honestly, reflects well enough. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, and in documents so private he never named a recipient, never titled them, apparently never intended them for eyes other than his own, about the specific difficulty of being virtuous without an audience. He returned to this again and again with the doggedness of a man who found it genuinely hard, not because he was failing, because he understood something about the structure of human motivation that most people prefer not to examine, that virtue performed in front of others is contaminated, always, by the performance, and that the only version of character that means anything is the version that exists when the performance stops. He was the most powerful man in the Roman world. He had every available reason to believe his virtue was real. He kept writing the reminder anyway. The discomfort of this is not that you are a hypocrite. Most people are not hypocrites in the simple sense. They are not publicly committed to principles they privately know they don't hold. The discomfort is more structural than that. It is that the public self and the private self are not the same instrument played in different keys. They are, in many respects, different instruments entirely, and the one you've been tuning your whole life, the one you've been observing, correcting, presenting as evidence of who you are, may not be the one that's actually running the show. William James, who understood the constructed nature of identity earlier and more rigorously than most thinkers who get credited for it, made an observation that is both obvious on its surface and almost never followed to its conclusion. A person has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize them. You are not a unified entity presenting itself differently in different contexts. You are a different self in each context, not in the shallow sense of adjusting your tone, but in the deeper sense that the values, the tolerances, the things you notice, and the things you overlook actually differ depending on who is watching. This is not a moral failure. It is how the self is constituted. The self is not a fixed substance that gets expressed differently depending on circumstance. It is, at least in significant part, a relational production. It comes into being through the particular pressures and expectations of the context it inhabits. The generous person in front of their peers and the impatient person alone in traffic are not the same person with different moods. They are different configurations of the same underlying material organized differently by different conditions. What this means for the question of private character is harder than it first sounds. You cannot simply resolve it by deciding to be as virtuous alone as you are observed, because the virtue you perform publicly is itself partly a product of the observation. Remove the observation, and you remove the organizing pressure that produced that particular configuration. What remains is not the real you, finally revealed. What remains is a different self, one organized by different pressures, subject to different defaults, running on different motivational logic. The question is what that self does with no one watching, not as evidence of who you secretly are, but as evidence of what your character is actually made of when it has to be self-generated rather than elicited. Here is the place in the argument where most people make a particular move, and it is worth naming before you make it. The move is to accept the general point. Yes, we are somewhat different in private than in public, everyone is, This is just human nature. And then immediately begin constructing an account of how your specific private self, on balance, reflects well enough. You were impatient, but you were tired. You said the unkind thing, but the provocation was genuine. You took the extra portion, cut the corner, looked away from what needed attention. But these were lapses, not patterns. And the pattern, assessed honestly, is one you can live with. Notice that you are doing this in your mind right now, even as you hear it described. This is precisely the mechanism Epictetus identified as the primary obstacle to genuine self-examination. He called it the failure to apply the same judgment inward that you apply outward. When you observe someone else's small selfishness, you register it accurately. You see it for what it is. You feel the appropriate response. When you observe your own, the faculty of accurate perception is replaced by a different faculty, the faculty of contextualization, the external situation, the particular pressures, the understandable reasons. All of it gets mobilized in the service of preserving the self-image rather than seeing the act. Epictetus was precise about what this costs, not reputation, which is external and therefore, in his framework, not a legitimate concern. What it costs is the accuracy of your own self-knowledge. You cannot know what you are if you cannot perceive yourself with the same clarity you perceive others. And the private self, the one you exempt from full scrutiny on the grounds that it is private, that the context was extenuating, that what matters is the overall pattern, is exactly where that accuracy is most needed and most consistently abandoned. The result is a person who has spent years observing, analyzing, and improving a character that is, at its foundation, somewhat fictional, not dramatically fictional, not in ways that would survive external examination, but fictional enough that genuine encounters with what they actually are, when the conditions strip away the social scaffolding, produce a discomfort that has to be quickly reprocessed into something that doesn't require revising the story. Jung's account of the persona gives this a more precise architecture. The persona, in his technical usage, is not simply a mask in the pejorative sense, not a cynical performance of a self you know to be false. It is the interface between the psyche and the social world, necessary and functional and not inherently dishonest. Every person develops one. It is how we become legible to others, how we fulfill roles, how we navigate the complex machinery of shared social life. The problem is not the persona. The problem is what happens when you lose track of where it ends. When the persona is functioning properly, you wear it consciously. You know you are the patient colleague, the dependable friend, the principled professional in those contexts. And you do not confuse this social identity with the full truth of what you are. When the persona is functioning as Jung described it going wrong, you have begun to identify with it. The role has become the reality. You have solved the problem of self-knowledge not by actually knowing yourself, but by successfully becoming your own public image. What this produces is a specific kind of crisis, which tends to arrive at moments when the persona is unexpectedly stripped. The job ends. The relationship ends. The circumstances change in ways that remove the context in which the identity was maintained. And what is encountered, in the silence that follows, is not the authentic self finally revealed. It is the shadow. Everything that was not accommodated by the persona, everything excluded by the long process of becoming legible to others, waiting in the dark with a patience that is only possible for things that cannot die. Your private self is not simply the unperformed version of your public self. It is also the accumulation of everything your public self required you not to be. The impatience that politeness covered, the resentment that generosity masked, the hunger for recognition that the performance of not needing recognition suppressed. The private self is, in part, the shadow finding what little space is available. This does not make it the truest version of you, but it makes it evidence of something real that the performed version cannot contain. Here is an application of this that most people do not anticipate. Think about your interior commentary, not the thoughts you have that you would be embarrassed to say aloud, Those are obvious. Everyone has them. They have already been filed as human nature. The subtler thing, the evaluations you run in real time about people you encounter in the privacy of your own processing, the colleague who explains something you already know, and the specific texture of what you feel during that explanation. Not embarrassment for them, not patience, but something adjacent to contempt that you would never name as contempt because you are not the kind of person who feels contempt. The stranger who does something mildly inconsiderate, and the instant narrative your mind generates about their character, not about the behavior, about the person, about who they must fundamentally be. The person whose success produces in you a response you immediately translate into something more respectable. Curiosity, intellectual interest, a kind of generous appreciation, but which, underneath the translation, has the unmistakable shape of envy. You process these privately. They leave no trace in your behavior. They produce no consequence. And because they are private, they don't enter the account you keep of who you are. But they are not nothing. They are in some respects more accurate data about your actual values than anything you would say in public, precisely because the absence of an audience removes the pressure to perform the values you endorse. The interior commentary is running on a different logic than the public behavior. It is running on something closer to the actual hierarchy of what matters to you, unfiltered by the social penalties attached to admitting it. Marcus Aurelius was doing something unusual in his private notebooks. He was treating his own interior commentary as subject to the same moral scrutiny he would apply to action. He was not satisfied with behaving well. He was attempting, at immense personal cost, documented across 12 books of struggle, to actually be what he publicly appeared to be in the space where no appearance was required. He kept failing, or he would not have kept writing the same reminders, but the attempt itself was the thing, the refusal to let the private self be an exception. Most people have never tried this, not because they are hypocrites, but because they have never understood that the private self is where the work is. They have treated it as a pressure valve, a space where the demands of the public performance can be released, rather than as the primary evidence of what the performance is compensating for. Nietzsche's analysis of how moral language functions cuts into this from a direction most people find uncomfortable when it is applied to themselves rather than to others. His argument in The Genealogy of Morals, the actual argument, not the caricature, is that moral evaluation is never neutral. It is always in the service of something. When a culture or an individual elevates a particular set of values as virtuous, Nietzsche's question is always, who benefits from this elevation? Whose position is secured? Whose weakness is protected? Whose limitations are made into principle by the decision to call these particular things good? The application to private versus public virtue is this. The person who performs goodness publicly and exempts their private self from scrutiny is, in Nietzsche's terms, running a specific kind of ressentiment. The performance of virtue is, among other things, a claim on others, a demand for recognition, for the social credit that comes with being seen as a certain kind of person. The private self that is not held to the same standard is the self that actually benefits from the transaction. The values are real enough in the contexts where they produce social reward. They are considerably more flexible in the contexts where they don't. This is not a charge of cynicism. The person Nietzsche is describing does not experience themselves as performing. They experience themselves as genuinely virtuous, with private lapses that don't count, in contexts that are unrepresentative, for reasons that would be understandable to anyone who knew the full situation. The sincerity is complete. The self-deception runs entirely beneath it. What Nietzsche calls for instead, and this is the part that gets dropped from most summaries, is what he names as genuine self-overcoming. The willingness to apply your values at their full weight in the places where the application costs you most, not as performance, not for recognition. In the specific contexts where no one will know whether you did it or not, and where the cost is therefore paid entirely by you, to no external account. The private self is exactly that context. It is where self-overcoming either happens or reveals itself as a concept you endorse without enacting. There is a way in which what Erich Fromm called the nekrophilos character illuminates something about the performed self that is not immediately obvious. Fromm used the term in a precise and specific sense, not in its clinical meaning, but to describe a character orientation drawn toward the static, the controlled, the dead, toward systems and procedures and fixed categories, rather than toward the living, the growing, the unpredictable. The nekrophilous character in his framework is threatened by what is alive and responsive, because aliveness cannot be fully controlled, predicted, or made to conform to the schema through which the self understands itself. The performed virtue, maintained over years into a kind of fixed identity, has this quality. It is a living process that has been made static, turned into a set of predictable responses, reliable outputs, a character that can be depended upon to produce certain behaviors under certain conditions. The performance has been refined to the point where it no longer requires genuine moral attention. It simply runs. And what runs on its own, without requiring the self to be genuinely present to each situation, is not virtue in any sense that would survive examination. It is habit wearing virtue's clothes. William James was the one who named this most clearly, though from a different angle. Habit, he argued, is the great economizer of the nervous system. It frees conscious attention from the ordinary and the repetitive. But the economy comes at a cost. What becomes habitual becomes invisible. You stop seeing what you are doing because you no longer need to see it in order to do it. The performed virtue has this structure exactly. It has become automatic enough that the person performing it no longer knows whether the performance corresponds to anything beneath it. The question worth sitting with, the one that has no comfortable answer, is whether what you call your values are currently living or static. Whether they are still generating genuine attention to the situations they encounter, still capable of being complicated by what they meet, still requiring you to actually think about what you are doing and why, or whether they have been refined into a set of outputs that runs without you, producing the right behaviors without requiring the actual presence of the person who was supposed to hold them. Here is the thing about private virtue that Aurelius understood, and that most contemporary accounts of character skip entirely. It is not primarily about whether you behave badly when no one is watching. Some people do, and some people don't. And the behavioral account is interesting, but not the deepest one. The deeper question is about attention. What does your private self pay attention to? What does it notice? What does it allow itself to know? A person who behaves correctly in private while carefully managing what they allow themselves to see, who keeps the budget-level awareness of their own conduct that makes the self-image sustainable, who processes the evidence of their own inconsistency at a speed that prevents it from fully landing, is not, in any meaningful sense, the person their public self claims to be. They have simply made the private self as managed as the public one. The management has become total. What genuine private virtue would look like, what Aurelius was actually pointing at in his notebooks, is not perfect behavior. It is unmanaged perception. The willingness to let what you actually do be seen by you clearly enough that it can produce a genuine response. Not contextualized, not immediately absorbed into the narrative, not processed through the faculty that exists specifically to prevent the self-image from being destabilized. This is harder than it sounds because the faculty of self-protection is not experienced as self-protection, it is experienced as accurate perception. The contextualizing, the interpreting, the reframing of your own lapses into understandable responses to difficult situations. All of that feels like honesty. It feels like the kind of fair, balanced assessment you would apply to anyone. It is, in fact, a highly selective fairness, applied with a rigor that varies precisely in proportion to how threatening the honest account would be. Frankl's formulation applies here in a direction he did not intend it. The space between stimulus and response, the gap in which the human capacity for genuine choice lives, exists in perception as much as in action. Before the question of what you will do, there is the question of what you will allow yourself to see. The person who closes that gap perceptually, who has automated the process by which threatening self-knowledge is deflected before it can fully arrive, has done something more fundamental than behave badly in private. They have removed the precondition for genuine self-knowledge entirely. The deepest version of this problem is not about specific behaviors or particular failures of private conduct. It is about what your private self is oriented toward. Fromm's definition of love, in the sense of a genuine moral orientation, not sentiment, was an active interest in the reality of another, not what is convenient for you that their reality should be, not the version of them that fits comfortably into your existing schema, but what is actually there. The willingness to be changed by accurate perception of what you're encountering. Applied to the self, this becomes the willingness to be changed by accurate perception of what you actually are, not the version that fits the story, the actual version, including the parts that the story was constructed to exclude. The private self is the place where this either happens or definitively does not. In public, you can always attribute your behavior to the context, the presence of others, the demands of the role, the requirements of the situation. In private, those attributions are not available. What you do with no one watching, what you think with no one to hear it, what you allow yourself to see with no one to require honesty of you. This is not the full truth of your character, but it is the test that the public performances cannot substitute for. And here's the particular difficulty. The person who has spent years performing virtue publicly has usually developed, as a consequence, a private self that is somewhat smaller than the public one. The performance required the compression of everything that didn't fit. The private self has less room to move, less capacity for genuine moral attention, less access to the parts of the psyche that generate the costly responses. Because those parts have been managed rather than exercised, maintained as performance rather than developed as actual capacity. The private self is not a relief from the public performance. It is where you pay the bill for it. Marcus Aurelius kept writing the same things to himself over years. Keep at it, get up, see things as they are. Do not be puffed up by what other people think of you. Do not be deflated by it either. Remember what you actually are beneath what you appear to be. He wrote them in Greek in the most private document available to him, in circumstances where the dishonesty would have cost nothing because no one would ever know. He kept writing because the pressure to drift, in his position, was immense. Not the pressure to do evil. He was not primarily tempted by cruelty or injustice in any simple sense. The pressure was subtler and more constant. The pressure to substitute the appearance of virtue for its substance. To let the reliable public performance take the place of the actual private orientation. To stop paying attention in the moments when attention was not required, because enough had already been demonstrated. He understood that character is not accumulated. It is not built up over years into a reservoir that can be drawn on. It is enacted, or not, in each situation as it arrives. And the private situations, the ones with no audience, are not easier versions of the public ones. They are the actual test because they are the only ones in which the social scaffolding that usually holds the performance up has been removed. You have, over years, built a self that functions quite well in public. It is consistent enough to be trusted, ethical enough to be respected, principled enough that you can, most of the time, regard it with something close to satisfaction. The question is whether it exists when you stop building it, whether the patience you are known for is also available in the room where no one will ever know whether you were patient, whether the generosity you are recognized for is also present in the decision no one will see you make, whether the values you cite when asked about yourself are the ones actually organizing your attention in the hours when they cost you something real and produce nothing socially in return, not as a standard to be met, not as a performance to be extended into the private space, as a genuine inquiry undertaken without knowing in advance what the answer will be, about who is actually there when the witness disappears. Most people have never asked it that directly. Most people have settled with some justification for the answer the public self provides. That answer is not wrong. It is incomplete in a way that the performance is structured to prevent you from noticing. The noticing, in the end, is the only thing that costs anything real.